Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. And a special welcome to those of you who are new to the world of Salzburg Global Seminar. Designs on the Future is something new for us. It's an open invitation to tackle tough issues and explore exciting opportunities. It's directly inspired by Salzburg Global's own radical roots. And at a time of deep polarization and reckless use and abuse of power and resources in too many places in the world, I wanted to start with a very brief reflection on why we chose as today's topic, big ideas. Will we still invest in ideas? This links directly to our own DNA and the values that underpin our programs and networks. Salzburg Global Seminar is what today we might call a big, hairy, audacious goal. We were founded in 1947, right out of conflict, out of the Second World War, by three young men who were inspired by watching governments create the Marshall Plan for Europe's economies under their noses at Harvard. But their idea was deeply human, a vision of the Marshall Plan of the mind, and what was originally called the Salzburg Seminar in American Civilization has stood the test of time. Our first co-chair was Margaret Mead, the mother of anthropology, and many of you, I'm sure, know her famous words: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. You can see from this slide, taken by one of our Young Cultural Innovator Fellows, Rebecca Willis, that those words themselves have stood the test of time. Here they are painted on a Detroit sidewalk in 2018. Now, critical to our DNA in that very first year was the idea of welcome. Not just welcome of people, but welcome of the other, engaging with the other, however much you dislike the idea, the individual, or the country from which they came. In the early years, straight after World War II, we literally had fellows who had been on opposite sides of the war sharing dormitories. In the Cold War years, Schloss Leopoldskron provided a very rare space for dialogue between opposing parties. And as our history's gone on, we've also tackled difficult ideas ahead of their time. For example, in 1988, we had one of the world's first program on AIDS confronting the epidemic. So we've been working for nearly 75 years, bringing together 38,000 fellows from around 175 countries in our mission to challenge current and future leaders to shape a better world. The commitment to engage rising young leaders and non-standard voices is as strong or stronger than ever. And we seek to have impact through ideas, there we go again, through individuals and through institutions. So Designs on the Future was conceived as we watched this year of all years converging crises around health, economies, climate, race, social justice, economic inequality. Our first two conversations have been very provocative and very timely. The first was, has democracy become a spectator sport, with Stacey Abrams, who has become a real heroine in the recent US elections and her work for participation in Georgia. The second was on how can leaders support racial healing, with LaJune Montgomery Tabaron of the Kellogg Foundation speaking about the importance, the responsibility of philanthropy in contributing to these structural changes. Today's conversation is just as huge, and it's even more focused on the long term. Will we still invest in ideas? COVID is a very weird thing and a very scary thing for us all to live through. It is sparking a whole slew of slogans: Build Back Better, Radical Renaissance. And at one level, we could say these far horizons are within our reach. Everyone's a publisher, everyone is a broadcaster now. But is this really a new dawn or just crumbs for the birds? We're living in an attention economy. There is the tyranny of digital distraction, but there is also the digital divide. Culture wars are on the rise, and none of us have enough time to absorb everything, and we see a serial collapse in trust in ideas, in science, and so on. Energy for change seems to come only from the streets or the margins. People are increasingly cynical about mainstream sectors and in institutional inertia. So today's question is really, how do we avoid post-COVID recidivism? Who today is ready to invest in the big ideas and the big thinkers that will shape, we hope, that better future? And in particular, will philanthropic and university leadership step up to this task? We've got the right person to provoke and enlighten us today in the form of Larry Kramer, the president of the Hewlett Foundation. But before I pass to Larry, Salzburg Global has real skin in this game. I showed you some images from our foundation. We've worked at the frontiers of education for decades. We pioneered global citizenship education from 2004 to 2015, and are very proud to see a great team now lead the Global Citizenship Alliance. We also developed a groundbreaking global program on genocide prevention and education, drawing not only on lessons learned, but also ongoing controversies around the Holocaust and Holocaust education. Again, as I said before, not being frightened to engage the other and try to bridge divides between sometimes deeply unpopular ideas. So philanthropy is also central to our work, looking systemically at how we can contribute to shifting financial flows and decision-making to support inclusive and sustainable development. And we look both within foundations, the way they work, and externally to the whole relationship now and tomorrow with grantees. So fittingly, today's conversation launches our 2020 philanthropy program, which is about philanthropy, inequality, and leading together through crisis, generously sponsored by the Hewlett Foundation. So in today's conversation, and it really is that, we're going to try a new format for our Q&A. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat box during the webinar by the top of the hour, so in about 25 minutes or so. And if you're selected, please look out for a message that you will receive to help you be ready to go live with your own question to Larry Kramer. So Larry, thank you for letting me give that context setter. Audience, you will find Larry's full bio in the chat box, but he joins us to share his insights from a very wide-ranging career that has seen him be Dean of Law at Stanford Law School, and for several years now, the president of the Hewlett Foundation, where he has really positioned the foundation to be at the forefront of change. The Hewlett Foundation has been a major benefactor to Salzburg Global in recent years. On education, right back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, we worked together to launch a universities project to bring senior level university leaders and academics together to build capacity in the former Iron Curtain countries. And the Hewlett Foundation has also been on the frontiers of global development, sponsoring programs with us on agricultural development in Africa, new frontiers in globalization, and the whole future architecture of global trade. So Larry, it is brilliant to have you join us, and we're so appreciative of you giving your time. You are clearly no stranger to swimming upstream, to being a disruptor from within. I'd love you to start by sharing a bit about what made you this way. What have been some of the milestones for you that make you so interested as a thinker and as a leader in ideas and the critical urgency of reinvesting in them? Flora, the screen is yours.
That's actually a hard question to answer. I mean, very quickly, my own journey here, I was raised in, a blue collar, white ethnic area outside Chicago, in which the idea of taking ideas seriously was not taken seriously. And sort of by accident, I ended up at Brown University, and it really was sort of by accident, but that was the first place I'd ever been where people actually did take ideas seriously, and that just enthralled me. So from that moment, I knew I wanted to be an academic, and then I had a career in the academy that eventually led to the work at Hewlett. But for me, always the notion of ideas and how they matter and how much they shape the world has just been what I have done. As a legal academic, I was an intellectual historian, constitutional history, but always interested in the ways in which ideas shape things. And then coming into the foundation, that was always going to be a part of what I thought we should do. It has ended up being a somewhat larger part, mostly because I think the rest of the sector so understates now. That was not historically true, but today understates and misunderstands the role of ideas.
Before we pick up on that, let's just focus for a moment longer on your career in academe, because the only time we've met in person in those lovely pre-COVID days was when you were still at Stanford Law. And I remember vividly how you talked about the ethos of public service and exposing these brilliant law students from around the world who'd come to Stanford to, I'm going to call it the boots on the ground, the realities of the practice of law as it is experienced by so many. Can you talk a little bit more about that first?
Sure. Again, legal education had been very unchanging for a very long time. I think when I started as dean. And there were just a lot of opportunities and things to do, but there were a couple of streams that came together. One was how many law students came out unhappy with the career opportunities that were ahead of them. Two was how satisfying the ones who did go into public service and public interest work found those careers. And then three was, though, that there was a sharp division in the law school where you did one thing or the other. And a lot of students, for a whole lot of reasons, didn't understand or know about or weren't engaged with the possibilities of doing public interest and public service work. And so it was a short mind shift to say, you know what, this ought to be a part of every lawyer's career. So we can construct a curriculum in which not just every student gets exposed to, but can really understand how this can be a part of their career, which of course serves the public, because lawyer and legal training are really very effective for all sorts of things and will produce lawyers who are more satisfied with their lives and their careers. So we built a lot of structures around that.
And if we widen out, sticking to universities, but widening out beyond law schools, there's a lot of talk at the moment about the utilitarian drift, if that's the right word, in education and in higher education in particular. Quite understandably, young people across the world are feeling very insecure at the moment, and there can be a whole set of family, cultural, and economic pressures to push you to what is seen to have value, to have the likeliest chance of, here I am waving my fingers, success. So I'd love to hear you talk a little about that perception of success and what you think is happening or should be happening in higher ed before we go on to philanthropy proper.
Sure. Well, that's a really long, we could do a whole nother, you could do a whole seminar around that set of issues. So, but just a couple of things that stand out for me. So one is, yes, I think it has been a mistaken shift that has taken place over the last 20 or 30 years to think that the value of a higher education or of education broadly is only about career development, as opposed to educating people for broader participation in society, for democratic citizenship, for interpersonal relations, for life self-fulfillment. Second, even within that frame of, this should be about career preparation, it's an incredibly narrow conception of what you need for success within a career. So it gets focused around, technical tools, as opposed to a broad liberal arts education actually is incredibly important for people, no matter what you're going to do. Learning how to write, learning how to think critically, et cetera, all those things are incredibly important for success across almost any career. So that's also been an unfortunate shift that's taken place. Third, even worse in my view, is the notion that the way we're going to value whether a university is succeeding in this respect is by asking what students are doing as they graduate from college. So this frankly idiotic measure that is like your salary when you graduate or your debt even when you graduate, as opposed to thinking in slightly longer terms and what happens to people, strikes me as just incredibly misguided and creates incentives to move education in the wrong way. And then lastly, there is a big challenge for education that they have not yet addressed, which is there is a lot more specialization and technical knowledge that is in fact needed. So we need to be thinking much more in terms of lifelong learning, where the period that you're spending in college is not the end of your education, but the beginning of it. And in which the universities both are preparing you to learn across your life and also providing opportunities for people to do so. And all of those things, I think, need to and are beginning to, I hope, shift so that universities can play the role they've always played better in a way suited to today's economy and pressures.
Well, I agree that there's a whole program or a series in the paradigm shift for education going forward, and that excites us here. I want now to grasp the references you made in different ways just then about the long term, about a different kind of time scale, and now to come into the whole question of philanthropy. So I said before that we've tried to choose provocative titles for the Designs on the Future series. And when on Twitter we posted the title of this event, I got a reply. So our title is, Will We Still Invest in Ideas? And the response to me on Twitter was, still? And I quote, American charities, ventures, and philanthropies stopped investing in ideas a long time ago because they simply cannot see far enough, and investing in an idea is too risky. So I would love to have you go straight for the jugular as you answer, share your reflections around that idea, because I know your views are strong.
Well, I think I agree with the comment. That is to say, if you think about philanthropy historically, investing in ideas was a big part of it. It's hard to date exactly when that stopped because it was not a sort of instant process, but somewhere over the last 30 or 40 years, a couple of shifts I think took place broadly in society that affected philanthropy. And that includes a lot of one of the unfortunate side effects and unintended side effects of the move to strategic philanthropy and needing to see measurable outcomes was a real foreshortening of the period in which people were thinking. So, needing to invest in things that are going to produce measurable outcomes in 3 to 5 years, that is seldom going to be something that happens if you're thinking about reshaping the way people think. So that's been a big effect. Another effect, though, I think has been it's an interesting to me, a general growth of, for better or worse, anti-intellectualism within the philanthropic world. So, and I think most people in philanthropy would not agree with that. But so here's what I mean by that. The focus in philanthropy is very much on action. I mean, I think goes without saying. And so people are interested in ideas, but they're only interested in the ideas immediately adjacent to the action that in effect justify it, without a sense that those ideas themselves are situated within a larger ecosystem of ideas that give the ideas that they are focused on force or make them weak, right? So you can have an idea like we should have government intervention to do X, and evidence that shows that if you do X, then Y will happen. But that is going to be situated in a larger set of ideas around the role of government generally. And if you believe that the role of government generally is bad, is weak, needs strong justification, then you're fighting an uphill battle. If, on the other hand, you're situated in a world in which the idea of government intervention is seen as natural and normal, then you have a downhill battle. And so those background ideas, political economy ideas, and so on, become incredibly powerful and important. Now, there was a time, particularly conservative philanthropists, invested in ideas, and they spent about 30 years building a framework that has now become a kind of conventional wisdom, and they're still reaping the benefits of that today. I should say conservative philanthropy has shifted, so it's no longer any different from progressive philanthropy. They're not investing in ideas much either, a little bit more than progressives, but not much. But they are still reaping the benefits of these earlier investments, which not only took a long time to develop, but then play out over a really long period of time, because ideas once established become very sticky.
So hearing you speak, you'd think that enlightened self-interest would still be catalyzing that kind of longer term view in philanthropy. Are you seeing anywhere in the world or around particular tools, things that give you more grounds for optimism? What are you seeing being deployed that you think is on the right lines and could start to shift those trajectories?
And again, just to be clear, it's not a question of enlightened self-interest, or, well, maybe it's emphasis on the enlightened, right? That is to say, I think what's been lost is the sense that ideas are a form of action, that ideas motivate people, not alone, right? Action at the end of the day, whatever action ends up getting taken, is a product of many forces. So it does matter what the politics are in the particular political configuration. It does matter who the proponents are and whether they're effective speakers and translators of ideas. All those things matter as well. But the ideas piece is incredibly important, and what's gotten lost is the sense that that piece matters. And so, this notion that we just need to build enough political will and we can beat the other guy that way. And, we see over and over again how that doesn't work. This recent election in America being a perfect example, I think, of that. We can maybe come back and talk about that.
I'm sure people would like to ask you about that.
But just in any event, we've been involved in an effort, and we're trying to put together a renewed effort to essentially not replicate, but do in the current context something like what the conservative funders did from the 1940s to the 1970s, which is really invest in the broad contextual ideas that shape the narrow political debates that we're having all the time. And we are finding uptake from some funders. It's a process, I think, for everybody to think through. There's still a natural tendency to want to fund down at the action end of things, but at least there's a growing appreciation for the links between that and the broader set of ideas. We find the movement people themselves fully understand this, and they're eager to have sort of new ways of framing and pushing their issues that they think will help them, and recognize that they're not necessarily the best people to do that. Funders, on the other hand, there is this other moment that's going on where actually all we're supposed to be doing is funding movement groups and communities. That is a different vector. It goes to some of the race issues that I imagine you spoke about with Lejeune. Those are real issues as well, but to some extent they're bleeding over into some notion that all funding, if it's not funding of community groups and just giving money with no notion of any agency on the part of the funder, that's what we're supposed to be doing. I think that's not very smart. I think there needs to be some of that, of course, but the notion that again, it's a broad ecosystem. You have to fund along the whole continuum to actually have something.
Yeah. And that was what was partly behind my question about what kinds of new tools, for example, do you think need to be deployed? I know one of our topics in this year's philanthropy program is around participatory grant making. And more broadly, we're seeing the shift of people and power. I expect to see very different paradigms developing with technology as an accelerator. So I'm interested in a quick couple of comments on that before we move into a couple of meaty subjects I want to draw.
Yeah, although let me step back. I'm all for new tools. I think we should employ new things where they seem sensible and will work. But actually the traditional tools were pretty gosh darn effective. I mean, the fact is we just haven't been deploying them well or in the right place. But a lot got done. And so there's not necessarily, it's not like, oh my God, unless you find some new tool to do this. The question of diversification, that is, say, bringing in other voices, that of course follows. But it doesn't follow that the way you have to do it is through some new way of doing philanthropy, because if it's not a new way of doing philanthropy, then what? I mean, the fact is that grant making to the right people with patience and giving them room to operate has been incredibly effective for a century and a half. It hasn't ceased to be effective. So as with all things, it's a question of being thoughtful. There are new tools. They should be thoughtfully deployed. Quite frankly, I think there's a lot of herd stuff and thoughtless deployment. So it's, we explore and are using many of those tools where they seem to us appropriate, but we can't escape our own agency, our own responsibility for making the choices about where the funds go. And that, I think, gives us really an opportunity to be thoughtful and smart and make sure things that need to get done can get done.
Absolutely. So let's turn to investing for the long term. There were three things that have leapt out for me seeing your work and the way in which the foundation is shifting priorities. And they were around democracy, climate, and the future of capitalism. So you've written a lot about the challenges of maintaining democratic government in the 21st century. Can you talk a bit more about what role, the ways you see that philanthropy can support ideas and practices to both combat polarization and nourish deliberative democracy?
Yeah, well, so you have to start with a theory of both the sources of polarization and the solutions to it, and then figure out whether there's a role for philanthropy. When we started the work, we started with a strong sense that it was a huge problem that needed to be fixed, but uncertainty about whether we could do anything about it. And our theory of change here is there is polarization within the society. There's a ton of empirical evidence which suggests, though, that while broad, it's not deep. There's also a ton of both experience, evidence, and I think common sense, which suggests that leadership matters. That is to say, and you see this whenever the parties, for instance, in the United States actually get together and do something in a way that where they bridge their differences, say as they did around education reform a couple of years ago, that gets immediate uptake from the public. Public would be eager to see that kind of thing happen. I mean, not maybe the fringes, but the fringes are pretty small, but the vast bulk of the society would. So the source of our problem, as we see it, is bad leadership. It's a top-down problem. It's people are taking their signals from their political leadership about how to behave and believe in politics. And so we spend some time trying to analyze, why is that so? Is it just that we have bad people up there? Or is there something about the structure of politics and the institutions that is forcing them into this mold? And if there is, are there things that we can do about it? So our approach has been that, which is we believe that there are structural reasons in the way politics has evolved that can be fixed, which will create space for political leadership to do what they did across most of American history and have done in other countries where democracy has succeeded, which is find ways to accommodate their differences and move things forward. Nobody ever gets 100% of what they want, but people feel like there's progress and movement. And so you don't get the kind of disaffection and alienation that you get when government is effectively doing nothing, which is what we've had for a while. So that's where our work had been focused. I will say we are making a shift now, mostly in the sense that we still think that's the long-term problem and the long-term fix that's necessary. As I jokingly said, if we could get the people in Congress to start acting like grown-ups again, the public will embrace that pretty quickly. But along the way, there have been a couple of other things that have been damaged that we think need to be fixed that are a little shorter term, but if we don't fix them, we're never going to get to the long term. And that is, we've had a breakdown in trust in elections that preceded Trump in this election, although he's accelerated it a lot. And so we need to focus on rebuilding the population's trust in our election systems. And that is everything from just the technology, which is old and out of date, to all sorts of processes, registration. And there are issues on both the left and the right that can and should be addressed to restore trust in the election process. And then second, the capacity of the government to deliver on what it does has been weakened. COVID exposed that in a big way. But again, it long predates that. The Trump administration broke a lot more about the way the executive branch could function. There is an opportunity to rebuild, not just to go back to what it was before, but hate to use the Biden phrase, but to build back better. So to restore these capacities in ways that solve some of the problems that predated Trump, as well as the problems that he's created. And if government can't deliver on what it does, again, you're not going to solve the disaffection and alienation. So we want to spend a little time addressing those. Those are easy for philanthropy to address, not necessarily easy to accomplish, but the means and tools for them are pretty normal and natural. The longer work about, fixing the political institutions that polarize leadership, that's a harder effort. And the hardest part of it, I will say, is the media part, is the effect of social media and of fragmented media, Fox News versus MSNBC, CNN, that kind of thing, in holding people off at the extremes and making it difficult for them to actually, it's not a question of moving to the middle. It's a question of just, because the ideological differences today are a lot smaller than they've been across most of history, a lot smaller. Problem isn't that we're ideologically divided, it's that we can't bridge our divides as they have always traditionally. So it's how do we get people to find those places where they can agree to move forward on something.
That's right. And where that kind of change can be happening. It reminds me, we have our Academy on Media and Global Change at Salzburg, which is working on media and digital literacy with an expanding global network precisely around these kinds of issues. It's a good moment for me just to remind our audience to keep putting your questions in the chat box. This is a very globally diverse audience. So as Larry just said, the issues and the interpretations of democracy and its current state of health are very different in your different countries. So I want to jump to climate now. And I know that one of your priorities—
Before we do, just one word on that global point, which is, yes, I did refer a lot to America, but the larger polarization problem is not American, it is global. It ties into this because we're seeing the same effect everywhere. What people are calling populism, which is really ethno-nationalism, and the emergence of that, which is a natural emergence when the idea set that had been structuring politics breaks down as ours has. So you're seeing that in Europe, in Hungary and Poland and Brazil and India, in the United States, Brexit. I mean, that itself is a global phenomenon. And, and the answers, although they are local in the sense that politics is local, are still similar across. So we can talk about that.
Absolutely. So that takes us seamlessly to climate, where again, think global, act local. I know that since you've been at Hewlett, the idea of changing collaborative paradigms around philanthropy on climate issues has been one of your priorities. But is climate philanthropy currently focusing on the right targets? What's working? Where do you see blind spots? And is there realism about the kind of scale of investment and ideas, investment and action that are needed?
So what I would say is the current investments in philanthropy are in some of the right places. The problem is there's more places that need investment than we have resources for. So the general strategy, I think that certainly the global funders have taken, I believe, is very much the right strategy. We started with a strategy which sort of looked from the present forward and said, what can we invest in today that will maximize reductions at the least cost? Then what's the next thing? Then what's the next thing? Then what's the next thing? And we realized a couple of years ago that that strategy wasn't necessarily going to get us where we needed to go. So we went for the other end and said, where do we need to be by, say, 2050 in order to get to zero, net zero? And thinking backwards, discovered that there were all sorts of things that we needed to be investing in that didn't show up when you were looking forward because they didn't necessarily have a quick payoff, but you needed to start investing in them now. And so there's been a lot of shifting around to take in things like carbon capture and storage, agricultural reform, just many forestation, many different kinds of things. And as I say, the issue is not so much are we investing in the right things or the wrong things. Everything that is being invested in, I think, is worth doing and necessary, but there are things that are just not covered because we don't yet have the resources. We have been making strong efforts over the last few years to increase the resources. We've had a couple of big entrants. Jeff Bezos, Mackenzie Scott are the most prominent recent ones. Bill Gates, having focused himself for a long time just on investments in technology, is now expanding into a lot of the other areas that are necessary. We had a huge slowdown during the Trump administration that I think will turn around now. So I think there are opportunities, and it's just a question of getting resources across the many things that need to be covered.
So let me follow up on that. How effective do you think philanthropy is at catalyzing action and resource pooling from other sectors, the business sector, getting more of a response from government, leaving the specifics of the Trump 4 years aside for a second? But how much are you as a sector effectively bridging divides to mobilize resources from others beyond the strict foundation context?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I would answer, I don't know that I can answer that in the sense that we're as effective as we should be or not as effective as we should be. What I think is we're plugging away at it and we're having successes. And in some places it's been very successful, say Europe. And in other places it has been less successful, say America. But you can feel the change happening. And I think, the idea is we just need to keep plugging away. What is clear to me is that philanthropy is critical to do that, though. I mean, you touch on exactly the right point, which is the solution to this at the end of the day will come from public action from governments, private action from business, and especially from the investment world. That needs to be unleashed. And philanthropy has a critical role to play in helping to unleash it. It's different for different kinds of things. And as I say, I don't know that I would say we've been less effective than we should be or more effective than we expected to be or anything like that. What I'd say is we're making progress. We need to make more. More resources would help do it faster and better. And sort of we're doing the best we can.
And carrying a big burden in that respect, because you're also pushing uphill in the sense that short-term imperatives are just as present in the political cycle, in corporate reporting and so on, even if those patterns themselves are changing. One last teaser for 60 seconds before we throw it open to our great audience. I know that you're at the beginning stages of launching an initiative on reimagining capitalism. Can you just sort of dangle a few thoughts about what's in your mind or your colleagues, your team's minds at this stage about what you would like to see enabled through philanthropy for longer term change?
Sure, it comes to that point we talked about earlier, which is to say, people have tons of ideas for what we can and should do differently to improve the economy, to distribute wealth better, to produce a more just distribution, to overcome some of the racial barriers that have limited success among many groups and so on. Lots and lots of ideas to do that. But they're still all situated within a paradigm that says markets are first, markets are better, government intervention is only if, it's still a problem, and there's all sorts of ideas on why you can't trust government and so on. And those were themselves philanthropically funded at a time when they may or may not have made sense, where they seemed to anyway. They worked as explanations for people. So what we're trying to do is link a lot of these ideas to a broader understanding, a revisiting of political economy, broadly speaking, the role of government, the role of markets, the nature of society. Is it discrete individuals competing, or is it actually we're social beings in a group? How do we think about success? Is success just growth, which is how we've thought about it? If it's not, if it's some kind of just distribution of certain essentials at least, how do we measure those? If you change those two things, then what are the right set of tools to take you from here to there? And then how do these proposals fit into that? So it's really investing in the broad background understandings or intellectual paradigm within which all these arguments take place, because they're taking place right now within one which does not work and is failing for more people, which, as I said, is leading them then to drift towards the next best explanation that's being offered. And right now, it looks like ethno-nationalism, right? When laissez-faire broke down, people drifted in the 1920s and 30s to the next best explanations, which for many people were communism and capitalism. Neither of those was particularly good. Ethno-nationalism isn't either, but if we don't offer people a better alternative, that's the direction we're going to keep going.
Totally. And that's why earlier in the conversation, I used the word about the risk of post-COVID recidivism, because the risks, if we have this hope of something better building up and then it's thwarted, could be huge for conflict in many areas. We're now going to open it up for questions. Thank you, Larry, for already a whirlwind tour and those ideas. So the first participant we're going to invite to give a question is Elena Greene, who's the CEO of Angels of Impact in the US, and she's participating in our current philanthropy program. So now my wonderful colleagues will work their magic to bring Lena up on the screen, I hope.
Yes, I'm right here.
It's worked. Fantastic. Please go ahead.
Yes. First of all, Larry, I just wanted to thank you very much that you wrote a statement out after all the horrible atrocities around racism in the US. And I wanted to commend you for that. You did write recently, I saw a post that you would provide money to organizations working on systemic racism, especially anti-Blackness, and that business as usual has to end. And I just wanted to have a conversation a little bit around that business as usual concept. You know, does philanthropy have structural racism embedded in it? For example, a lot of times people of color tend to be seen as beneficiaries as opposed to change agents. There's power balance, for example, in the way metrics and reporting is done, and that's predetermined by the philanthropists as opposed to what the community believes is best for themselves. And the other one about who gets funded, for example. Traditionally, a lot of philanthropy likes to give to a certain size or an organization that's been around for a certain number of times, which automatically disqualifies a lot of movements done by people of color. So how do you see this changing? And how do we see this really addressing structural racism at the root cause? And just a quick point, I also notice sometimes we tend to like to think about climate change, or we'd like to think about going to the moon, because sometimes it's easier to address those problems than to talk about people. So I just wanted your viewpoints about that.
Sure, except for the last one. Climate change is about people.
I was about to say too.
If we don't solve the climate change problem, none of the rest of this will matter. I mean,
Exactly.
We have to be honest about that, and I mean that literally. None of the rest of it will matter, because the social, political, economic structures we have today will collapse. And then we're talking Mad Max. Okay, put that one aside. I actually do say, like, climate is different. I say that inside my foundation. It's different from all the other things we work on, because they're also, the other ones, there are problems. We're not going to ever solve them completely. We do our best to make improvements and mitigate, and we have time so we can change what we're doing and slow down to address many of the things that you're talking about. For instance, right, if what we care about is getting something done quickly, then many of the organizations that are best positioned to do that are the big traditional white-run organizations. Of course, they're there because they've been supported in the past. So if we want to change that, then we have to support organizations that right now are not in the same position to deliver in the same way, but we have to support them to get them there. So in that sense, we'd be saying, you know what, we're going to worry a little less about making progress in the next year or two to redress the consequences of a historical misallocation of funding and produce the kind of equality. But we believe in the longer run, this is going to do at least as well or possibly better. And so we'll do that. So that kind of thinking, as I say, in climate, it's a bigger challenge because we don't have longer. You know, we've got about 10 years, 20 years at most, and then things are going to get really bad. Not to say we don't do it, we just have to think about it differently. And then, so my answer to what you're saying is, I think all of that is true, but I don't want to paint with too broad a brush the other way either. So the answer is, there are many, many ways and places in which racism, structural racism, is embedded in what we do, in the same way that it's embedded in every system in society. And so we have to look for it and think about it and address it where we find it as we find it. but there's not some simple rule like, you know what we need to do is just stop exercising agency and grant making and give to communities. That's like, I hate when people say that. I don't even know what that means, as if there's some monolithic community out there that we're giving money to, right? It's just not like that. So, so what we've tried to do internally, I charged all of our programs independently, each of them within their fields, to step back, try and understand where and how systemic racism may be affecting either who they're choosing for their grantees, how they have thought about their problems, how the problems are being worked on, and are there ways in which we can address it that will help us achieve our goals. And so I don't expect one answer to that. I expect many different answers. I expect it to take a little time as they find what they need to do and implement it at different paces and places. But to me, that's how you have to think about it, recognizing that it is absolutely a problem, but that it's subtle and different. And so you need awareness of it, and the way you're going to address it will be subtle and different. And it doesn't necessarily require abandoning either all of the ways you are working now or all of the goals that you have now. And that's what worries me, the discourse that we're having in philanthropy. Partly it's because of blogs. Everything is in like 750 words, and there's no room for subtlety or complexity in our own conversations.
So I'm hearing that being holistic, being forensic, being open, being rigorous, and being honest are absolutely fundamental to your leadership role within an established foundation to really understand and address what does need to be changed and continue great work, or use the tools you have to keep moving forward. I want to bring in, thank you, Elena, for the question, and I want to bring in Rebecca Roberts now, who's doing her PhD in Berlin and is also participating in the current philanthropy program. Rebecca, you are going to magic up on my screen. I can see your name appearing. Here you come. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly, thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Larry, for the insightful talk. I guess my question is about anti-intellectualism, like you said. So my question is, as somebody who works in philanthropy in the last 10 years, usually what we find is that there's a disconnect between intellectualism and the reality of things. So do you agree with this? And if you do, how do you suggest that this can be harnessed for planning for an impactful future?
So don't go away, because say a little more about, what you mean by that disconnect.
The disconnect being intellectualism being different from the reality on ground. So say, for example, in funding, the funder comes in with a preconceived notion of what exactly they want to fund, when the reality on ground is different. So how do you think this sort of...
So I would say yes. So that's bad philanthropy. I think it's just, you have to do your homework. You have to listen to the people you're trying. We have a whole broad effort, both inside and outside the foundation, for the sector generally, to help put together better tools for people to listen to the people they're trying to work with and help. We have a whole long culture of trying to, our grantee, it's all about decentralization. Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard, their company, Hewlett Packard, was famous for its what they call the HP way, which was you find good people, you give them the resources, and then they do it. And so we try and do that in our philanthropy, and I think that's critical. So with bad philanthropy is people come in with ideas, having not actually listened or talked to the people they're trying to help, and then just insist on forcing them. I was thinking of something, just so you know, a little different, which, as I say, is the extent to which ideas themselves can be a form of action. In other words, changing, there's like too much of the hearts and too little of the minds when we talk about changing hearts and minds. And I think philanthropy has gotten away from the notion that actually we need to think about the way in which people frame the world. It's not just about their immediate political interests or needs, although it's about those things too, but even how people understand their needs, where their emotions are shaped is very much a product of the way they understand the world intellectually. And that piece of it has just dropped out of the thinking of most funders and well, I will only say most funders, because there's plenty of organizations that are thinking that way, and just funders aren't interested in supporting them.
Yeah.
Do you want to add anything to that, Rebecca?
Yeah, that's fine. I was just thinking about in light of, as he was speaking, I was just thinking about an experience that I've had where we were trying to get the funder to actually conduct a preliminary conversation to speak to the people about why the particular project has failed previously and from their perspective why. So I was just thinking about this, from what he was saying. Thank you so much.
If that's ever Hewlett, though, you should let me know directly, because really we have all sorts of, we're not supposed to do that. They are supposed to, actually listen. I mean, that's critical.
Rebecca touches on such an important point, which is that also that courage to listen and learn from failure and to be open about that. I know that's part of my personal journey. I don't think some of us are not born quite figuring out how to talk about the things that really, really, really did not work. But as I think anybody in leadership positions in institutions knows, that act of honesty is very important for entrepreneurship and to change the structures of the way your companies and institutions work.
Can
Rebecca, thanks so much.
Oh, just a quick word on that. I mean, because early on, I said to my staff, I said, part of the reason people find it hard to talk about failure is how much time we spend talking about how hard it is to talk about failure. The fact is, it shouldn't be hard to talk about failure. And I actually try and stay away from the words failure and accountability. To me, it's learning. And so we're working with a partner. We need, if it's not working, let's figure out together why not and what we can do to make it work better. So there's nothing wrong with it not working, other than it's a signal that we should think together. And that's what it means to have a partner, right? So it's not a question of you have to prove to us that you're succeeding in the way you said you would, and if not, we're cutting you off and going to somebody else. Like, again, that would be bad philanthropy. We picked you because we think you're the right person and we want to work with you to figure out how to do this best, listening to you, but then you have to be honest with us, and we have to make you not afraid to do that. And that's true within the organization as well. It is hard to do, but I do think it's because of how much time we spend talking about how hard it is, which actually has, it's like going in a room and saying, nobody panic. It's the best way to get people to panic.
But that's you're adding more nuance to the whole notion of partnership, and we are always profoundly grateful to the great partners we work with. But that idea, going back to other themes of this conversation, of trust, of confidence, and knowing that openness can operate to the advantage of both sides is important. Thanks, Rebecca. You really stimulated some great debate there that really followed well on Lena's question. Now we're going to bring in Stacey Baird, who's a Salzburg Global Fellow from two areas of our work, law and technology, and also corporate governance. And Stacey's based in Hong Kong. Stacey, are you with us? He is now. He's coming live. In probably a horrible time zone for him as well. So Stacey, we doubly appreciate you staying awake.
I apologize. Absolutely.
Right.
I apologize.
We have you now. We have you now, and thank you for staying up past your bedtime to join this conversation.
Happy to do so, really. And Larry, thank you very much for your time. This has been fantastic so far, and I look forward to the rest of it. I have a question, but before I go to that, you made the distinction of climate. And one of the things I'd observe is that although the climate challenge is the most existential and therefore dominant in terms of, you're right, nothing else will matter if we don't solve it. We actually know what to do. Whereas the social challenges is really about changing people's minds or ways of thinking and addressing the issues of why they think what they think. So I think it's harder in a sense to be addressing those changes. Whereas with climate, you're really just talking about changing behavior, which somehow seems less daunting. But to get to my question, and the theme of this is, will we still be investing in ideas? It seems that it's a time where ideas are the most important to be able to move us forward in this incredibly challenging time of, radical social divides, obviously COVID recovery, the impact of innovation on globalization on society and on individuals. And we need big ideas, at least in my fantasies. So how do you map that in your strategy?
Sure. So quick word on climate, which is, to me, the biggest thing that's different about climate is just that there are these tipping points. So 2 degrees is not an arbitrary number. right? Around 2 degrees is where things like the ice sheets in the Arctic and Greenland melt, and the permafrost melts, and the amount of methane that then gets thrown up in the atmosphere kicks us to 4 or 5 degrees, and there's nothing we can do about it at that point. And so that's why that's so important and what makes it different from any other problem. You're right, the other ones are harder and longer term, and as I say, I don't think we're ever going to solve them in the sense that they'll go away. We mitigate them as best we can. They keep changing, and we have to keep adapting with them. Another reason, I think, for funders to stay in this for the long time. Okay. In terms of ideas, the way I frame it, it's not that we need big ideas exactly, but we need a way to put together our ideas in a way that make coherent sense. And that's, in some sense, what people mean by big ideas. So if you think about, I think of this in terms of, there are these intellectual paradigms that are broadly shared, within which left-right agreements actually take place. There was always left-right disagreements, but so in the 18th century, everybody was a mercantilist. In the 19th century, it evolved into laissez-faire. In the mid-20th century, evolved into Keynesianism. Those were, in some sense, big ideas, but what they really were a coherent way of putting together people's experience of the world that worked as an explanation. For experts down at the bottom, it was a full economic and political philosophy that they could use to generate solutions that worked well enough that it reinforced the kind of bumper sticker understandings that people like my mother would have, ordinary citizens, and the politicians could use to translate between the two. Those paradigms break down from time to time, and they typically break down when there are significant changes in the society that they stop working. So the second industrial revolution, communications revolution, transportation revolution in the late 19th and early 20th century made that laissez-faire thing no longer work. But it took, and they're sticky. So it still took the Great Depression and World War I to shock enough people out. And as I say, people then, when that was no longer working, drifted towards other explanations that were out there, some good, some not so good. Same kind of thing happened in the 1970s when the post-World War II Keynesian framework that was put in started to break down because of the reemergence of Germany and Japan into the economy and all sorts of things. And we're experiencing one of those moments now for the reasons that you're suggesting. And it's not that we don't have what we're really trying to do is, so we can say that way of thinking about like growth is our goal and government is bad except to redistribute after we've generated growth, and efficiency should be what we're after as we structure all those ideas. They do not fit this economy. They've produced massive wealth inequality. They don't work for the way technology works in markets. There's also the global trade regime, which was, generated a lot of wealth for a lot of people, took a lot of people out of poverty, but is massively exacerbating inequality, not delivering there. Also, so we need a different way to look at our ideas. So it's not so much that we don't have the ideas, we need to put them together in a different frame that will elevate some things that have been suppress some things that have been elevated, and work in a way that people say, okay, that makes sense to me. COVID is a brilliant opportunity because it underscores the necessity for government to play a role that it has been denied for so long. And so, as I said, we have the opportunity. It's the thing that worries me is, in each of these, Keynes, for instance, started doing his work in the early 20th century, so that by the time the Depression hit, it was like fully developed. Same thing with the neoliberals, started in 1947, so by the 1970s, we should have started this around 1980 when Thatcher and Reagan were elected, and we didn't. So we're a little behind in terms of developing our new paradigm. And that's really what we're trying to invest in quickly, to find the people who have the ideas, because it's not us who's going to have them, and throw them together and say, come on, guys, come up with something that makes sense. And it's a bit of a market itself, like try different things, let's see what sticks. And that's what we're trying to do. So it's thinking about how to combine ideas in ways that fit the world as it has evolved to produce the goals that we now recognize we need. So a more just distribution of wealth, the redressing of racial disparities that are a product of racism on top of a system, and so on.
What I'm hearing, Larry, is all that, but also the critical need for more strategic foresight, a capacity within the sector to be able to be better at looking beyond the horizon, as you say, to get better at starting the work before the crisis is upon us, or before the tipping of the landscape into unleveling of the playing field gets too acute.
Well, it kind of comes back to Rebecca's point, because it's not that we need the foresight, it's all we need is the foresight to recognize when people come to us pushing us to think about something different, to take those chances. let's say the ideas don't come from inside philanthropy, that would be pretty shocking. They should come from people out there living their lives, dealing with these problems, but we just have to be listening to them.
You remind me, yesterday we were moderating one of the Race to Zero climate dialogues with Nigel Topping, who's the czar for the next big climate conference. And I used the trio of listening, imagination, and courage as being part of what we need to actually shift these paradigms. And your emphasis on the listening and really thinking about what we're learning from the ground is so critical. So now we're going to move, thank you very much, Stacey. And we're going to move now to Andy Solomon, who's also a participant of the program, the Philanthropy program. And Andy is the principal and founder of Stratford Communications in the US. Andy, please come on screen, come on board. You're about to come live on my screen here.
There I am.
I see you. I see and hear you.
Larry, thanks so much for being with us today, Larry. I enjoyed hearing your presentation. Can you give some specific recent examples of philanthropy supporting ideas that reflects what you're talking about? And don't those ideas at some point have to lead to action that then has impact? I mean, are you advocating for ideas that are completely in the absence of impact? Or what's the connection between ideas and action? And then a sort of second question, if you have the time, is I'm interested in your perspective, because I know you've written about this before, on the ways philanthropy should better collaborate and thus sort of multiply its impact and accelerate its efforts.
Sure.
Thank you.
So the first part, let me ask you a question in return. Do you think it important to invest in basic research? Or should the only investment?
Yes, I do. I do. Okay. I think the reason to invest in basic research is that it informs research with practical implications.
And that's all I'm saying. And that's true for ideas and research in fields in the social sciences as much as it is in the natural sciences. And we have ceased to invest in basic ideas completely, and we're only investing down at the bottom. And that it so limits the kinds of things you can imagine even. That to me is the real, what's so interesting when you look at the neoliberal success. Hayek kicks that movement off in 1944 by publishing a book called The Road to Serfdom. And at the time the book is published, it's considered this like radical screed, reactionary, extreme right. If you read it today, it's like a half an inch to the right of the New Deal. I mean, it's filled with government programs and so on. By 1962, when Milton Friedman publishes Democracy and Freedom, he's got out on the table ideas that were not imaginable in 1944. And that's the point, right? It reshaped what we can imagine and think about doing. So of course it has to be linked. As I say, when I look at the ecosystem we have now, the problem is that not that we don't have enough funding down there at the, the ideas for action. It's that we don't have enough funding on the upstream stuff that will reshape and shape and strengthen the arguments for the ideas for action. So we want to fund along the whole continuum now. And when I take you to the collaboration point, I don't need to fund along the whole continuum. It just needs to be being funded. So that goes to working collaboratively with other funders. Many of the funders, that's where they want to fund. It's like, great, you guys fund there, we'll fund here. What we need to make sure is that we're linked and talking to each other, both us and the grantees, so that we have some sense that we're actually making progress together, and that what we're not doing is funding abstract ideas that nobody's interested in. That would be a mistake. Or funding programs that are in no way linked to any better, different kind of upstream way of thinking that will strengthen their arguments. So that's how I think about that.
And did you want to come back with any further questions?
Are there recent examples of philanthropy funding new ideas that you think are models for what you're talking about?
Well, so, I mean, the best examples I can give are, in the work that we and others are beginning to launch around what we've called Reimagining Capitalism, although I hate that name, so we're probably going to rename it something like Economics and Society. And, and there'll be much more of this in the next couple of years, I hope. But, the way you do this funding is we have looked around the world for economists, social scientists, political scientists who seem to be thinking, I hate the phrase outside the box, like who are thinking like there's no box. Just what's a set of ideas that seem to work better, and we're funding them. So we've been funding, So some of them are centers, the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford, the Center for Equitable Growth in DC. Some of them are people, Paul Pearson, Jacob Hacker, who have this whole notion of pre-distribution. There are efforts to rethink the way labor works being put forward by David Rolfe and Nick Hanauer. So that's what we're doing. It's a mix of experiments linked to big ideas themselves, think tanks, just where we hope that ideas will begin to be generated. And I said to my board, it's a kind of throwback kind of philanthropy, right? Because what we're doing is we're not going to people and saying, what's your deliverable in 4 years? We're saying, we're gonna put some faith in you and we're gonna stick with you for a while and do what you do and let's see what emerges. And so Mariana Mazzucato, there's like a whole big community of people who've been thinking about this. And then in addition to funding their work, we've been doing convenings with them, putting them together, sharing their information. We funded a program at Harvard run by Danielle Allen on the philosophical side to bring them all together, and we'll see what emerges from it. So it's that kind of funding. And as I say, we have a faith that it will be linked to the action down the line. But if we start by demanding that we know exactly what, our theory of change, our logic model requires that every step be specified before we start, we've failed before we started. It is exactly, and that's what's a little different about this. And it's risky.
Andy, thank you so much for that question. Your mention of Mariana Mazzucato was a great timely point, because she's just this week been chosen to lead the World Health Organization's whole new initiative on health and the economy. But this was an academic focusing on ideas that at one point were way upstream. I'm going to read a part of a question from another of our great fellows from culture and media programs that we run, from Kara Schaffer. And I almost have put my glasses on. So Kara is asking, what you see is the best way to break through what seems to be a COVID lockout. She's on the ground in Detroit, and many major funders have suspended their yearly competitions, which for people like her as a photographer and a documentary maker have been a large source of what enabled her work. She says, I'm sure this is not limited to my sphere, but is felt in many different arenas.
So just make sure, is she on?
So the crisis. So this is, Kara's really asking a question that includes but goes beyond herself.
But if I understand, she's asking about funders are shifting to focus on COVID, and so not funding their. They're
suspending their yearly competitions or the kind of entry points into getting the chance of philanthropic support. She's feeling that because she's a documentary photojournalist, but she thinks that it may be other people as well. So in a sense, Kara, if you don't mind me paraphrasing you, the pipeline for having a chance of access to philanthropic funding is being completely disrupted by COVID, either because philanthropic foundations are seeing their own resources hit, or because they're doing a radical reallocation of what's available.
Gosh, I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I mean, the way the Hewlett Foundation operates after 2012, so that in any given year, we have a really large amount of unallocated funds, so that when COVID hit, we use those to address COVID without having to change any of our other funding priorities or increase our spending and so sell out our future. Funders who haven't done something like that are in a choice. Some funders have chosen to just increase their spending. So that is one solution. And there are, according to a survey I saw recently, about a third of funders have been thinking about doing that. So hopefully the increased spending goes to address COVID, but they're still able to support their ongoing grantees. I'm sure there are some funders who are just, they're just going to make that shift, and there's not much you can do except wait it out. Fortunately, if these vaccines, play out as we hope they will, that may turn out to be just a 1 year gap, maybe a 2 year gap at most, and then they will get back to it. But, it is a community that operates independently. Every funder makes their own decisions around this. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot I can recommend for you to do in a context like that. I think for what it's worth, the arts are getting hit particularly hard. I should say, I think because we fund the arts. And it has always bothered me the extent to which funders who supposedly care about social justice don't see the arts as actually a social justice program. I mean, we see it as a social justice program. It's a way to help communities express issues and problems and reach and change people's minds and thinking. So, but many funders don't. So when something hits the art, we've seen a big decrease in arts funding over the last decade. as people thought, no, we have to shift and do more social justice funding.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can find a reflection of that in what we talked about earlier about universities, the humanities, the liberal arts, and the investing in the deeply human as the absolute bedrock of our own futures. Before I pass on to our last question, I just wanted to pick up on something that Andy Solomon was talking about, this question about examples of investing in ideas. And this will be a crudely phrased question, but really about supply and demand, how people who are having the ideas, whether they even think of those things as things that could be fundable. Do you somehow change your brand or the way you actually advertise and encourage more people to come in from the marketplace, more diverse people to come in from more different types of settings to see you as a potential partner?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that I have an answer to that, in the sense that I'm not sure I've thought about it exactly in those terms before. Partly, I suppose, because, we have not experienced a dearth of people who are coming to us, including a very diverse, and it's very diverse group, at least certainly in all the traditional, if we think about the conventional categories for diversity, race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, all of those. But they are coming from universities, think tanks, and although, movement groups. So we have not, because, people who have ideas and need funding for them still will think at least to take a shot at the philanthropic sector, because there aren't many other alternatives.
Well,
I could be missing something. I'd want to think about that some more.
Yeah, it just came into my head listening to what Andy had said. So we're finishing off with a question from a different Andy Ho, who's our development director at Salzburg Global Seminar. He'll ask just a brief question back, and then after that, we'll then go into wrap up. Andy Ho, the floor is yours.
Hi, Larry. Thanks for doing this. My question is that it's all good to invest in ideas, even in the face of urgent specific needs like climate change and the pandemic. But it seems the differences and inequalities between people are greater than ever, and listening to each other's differing ideas seems at best a polite exercise, and at worst, only taking place in an echo chamber. So how would investing and listening to one another look like?
So you have to say a little more, because you built into that question that you think it's just an exercise in politeness. So you mean, how can we do it differently so that it matters?
Yeah, how can we do it differently so that it matters, so that actions take place, so that people can come to agreements and ultimately move forward, gotcha. Progress.
So, yeah. I wrote an essay a couple of years ago called "Listening to People Who Think We Are Wrong," which was on that question. And so first you have to have the desire to actually listen and to think that you have something to learn from it. And then, the listen, what's happened in our debate and discussion is we don't have that anymore. The essay I sort of identified, there's three things people do when they hear arguments on the other side. One is a straw man version of it that can be easily dismissed because it's ridiculous. That's a traditional move. But the two more recent ones are, we can dismiss the person on the other side because of who they are, right? So, oh, you're a white person, therefore, blah, or you're a Black Lives Matter supporter, therefore I don't have to pay any attention to you, or you're in the oil industry, or you're an environment, whatever it is. Like, once I've said who you are, I can just dismiss your ideas. And then, the third version is, actually, I know that you think I'm right and you have a bad motive. You're a racist or you're self-interested. So to me, the first thing we have to do is put all that stuff aside and recognize that an argument that seems unreasonable to us does not seem unreasonable to the person on the other side who's making it. And we have to make a real effort to understand how it seems reasonable to that person, even when it seems hurtful to us, and because if we want to advance our own ideas, we have to start there. And that can have lots and lots of benefits. It helps us find the ground for common understanding. It lowers the temperature, at least, on the disagreements, if we do it, honestly and fairly and so on. So that is an exercise. I think of it as actually what law school was all about, training students to do, literally. But it was hard with law students. But I think that's an important part, at least, that we need good faith listening. And if we do that, then the opportunities present themselves. Now, on your other point, again, the relationship between ideas and action, we do need action now. So as I say, I'm not saying let's stop, hold the present, steady while we spend a bunch of years thinking things through, and then we can start to act. It's an ongoing process, as it always will be. We are learning on the ideas side from the things that are happening and how they're doing. So we do need to be pushing for things to happen. And as I say, from my perspective, there's no shortage of that in philanthropy. That's what 99% of philanthropy is about. My belief is that it will ultimately be more effective if it's actually linked to these other things, because think of it this way. Medicare in the mid-1960s was still an uphill fight because of a lot of political interests, but it was also consistent with the prevailing political economy ideas. And so once it was through, it was accepted fully and embraced, and we went forward. Obamacare, which was pretty close to a market-based solution, nevertheless was against the conventional framing, and it has not been accepted, right? Even now. I think it'll survive and so on, but and the difference between those two is the difference between those background ideas. So you would have wanted to keep pushing, but if we need to also be reshaping the background ideas in a way that justify more of the action that will actually improve our world.
Thank you.
Larry, that was really helpful. That contrast between the Medicare and the Obamacare, at least for me as a non-American, it sort of sheds some light there. Do you want to add any brief final wrap-up comment before I close this out? We have about 4 minutes, and I do know that you have an all-staff meeting not far behind the end of this fantastic webinar. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or any call to action you'd like to give to our fellows who are now embarking on this really brilliant philanthropy program this year?
No, I mean, appreciation for giving me the opportunity to speak. It's hard. I wish it were a live room so I could see people's reactions.
So do we.
No idea, like people could be steaming at home with a bunch of ignorant things that I said. But I appreciate the opportunity. I think, the one piece of advice I would give, if I could give any, would be, it is distressing to me. People don't need to agree with me on anything. I mean, I'd like them to, but it is distressing to me the extent to which I believe there is a kind of absence of real critical thinking within our sector. And so, I just think I would urge everybody to think hard about all of the new pressures and the new things that we're being pushed to do, because I think there's a lot to all of it. But we're not having an actual engaging and engaged debate about what's good and what's bad about the old paradigm, and the kind of herd effect that takes over in philanthropy is often distressing. So I think it's complicated. The issues are complicated, and the answers as a result are not simple. But so I would urge everybody to recognize that and treat the issues that way, and think as critically about the new things that are being offered as about the old things that are being criticized. Both should be criticized and thought about critically, and use your own minds to figure out what your own views are.
That's such a great line to send us all away with, and it goes back to that issue about listening, imagination, and courage, because we really need a skill set that is up to the mark for the needs around us. It's presumptuous to even pull out any sort of key things from such a rich discussion, but bad leadership came out in different ways again and again through your conversation as something that has to be tackled collaboratively across the philanthropy sector, and by more effective co-working between the philanthropy sector and the other levers for change in our society. And in different ways, you highlighted the importance of responsibility in philanthropy and investment, the application of a filter of judgment, of critical thinking, and of that, not just listening on the ground, but rekindling that notion of partnership as being there for mutual support rather than harsh judgment that puts people in a fear of failure. And I wrote down, avoid the F word, meaning in this case, failure. You also use metaphors that related to energy, this unleashing of the power of the sector, and highlighted the importance not only of trust rebuilding, but of delivery, of earning the regaining of trust, particularly in the public sector, by meeting the basic needs of citizens and people. We, as my poor colleagues know, I have a favorite question, which is, who don't you know how to talk to? And your emphasis on humility, on empathy and listening, I think ran through the whole conversation. And that need also for good faith to be part of the listening exercise as the sector is rekindled. those aspects are very close to our education program now, Education for Tomorrow's World, which focuses on social, emotional learning and life skills. And some of our partners are on this call now. And we see that as part of our paradigm going forward, part of our big ideas that at Salzburg Global we're hoping to help to lead. So completing, Larry, it was absolutely brilliant to have you give so much of your time in this kind of fireside chat. I feel very firesidey here in the Reinhardt Library in the Schloss, even though it's actually rather cold because we forgot to close the windows. For all our audience, thank you so much for joining. Just to give you a heads up, as I mentioned at the beginning, our Designs on the Future series is really one big live experiment. You're part of it. Thank you, Larry, for being one of our guinea pigs.
Thank you.
And coming up on the 1st of December, we have the next in the series with an eminent global historian and provocative thinker on should history carry a health warning. All of you and all your mates are very welcome. Larry, you're extremely welcome to sit there and pose Margaret Macmillan some very provocative questions. But really, the point behind all this is just to build community, not only because of COVID, but especially during COVID. And we are a global community, and everybody on this call is just so welcome to be here. So once again, Larry, thank you a million. Hope we haven't made you late for your all-staff call. And thank you again to the Hewlett Foundation for making our work in philanthropy possible and so much in Salzburg Global's past. Have a great evening, morning, breakfast, everybody, and stay healthy. Thank you.